Hey friends, tonight we step quietly into the overlooked corners of the Middle Ages, not to marvel at castles or kings, but to explore the quieter, heavier truths of daily life, truths rarely written down, but deeply felt. While we often picture feasts and battles, the reality was slower, harder, and filled with silent struggles that shaped every breath. So before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy these calm, thoughtful dives into the past. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Enduring the endless damp that crept into every corner, imagine waking to the smell of cold stone and wet air. The hearth has gone out overnight, and the morning chill has crept into the fabric of everything. The wool blankets, the coarse linen sheets, even the straw-stuffed mattress beneath you. The walls glisten faintly with condensation. Your breath is visible in the gloom. Somewhere nearby, a wooden beam lets out a quiet creak as it shifts in the damp. This was not the aftermath of a storm. It was simply life. In the medieval world and well into the early modern period, dampness was not an occasional nuisance. It was a constant, creeping presence, a quiet adversary that defied wealth, planning, and effort. Whether one lived in a timber-framed cottage or a stone manor, the moisture found its way in. It clung to thresholds, pooled in corners, and softened everything it touched. Even the grandest homes, with their thick stone walls and tiled roofs, were not immune. The very materials that offered insulation from wind and cold also invited condensation. In the winter months, as fires burned inside and frost formed outside, the walls began to sweat. Moisture gathered slowly, forming beads that traced lines across the stone, dripping into crevices and collecting on the uneven floors. Floor coverings, often made from rushes or straw, were meant to keep feet warm and absorb spills. But over time, they absorbed far more than that. Water seeped upward from the ground below. Most floors were simply packed earth or crude stone. Combined with soot, food scraps, and the natural oils from bare feet or leather soles, the rushes became a damp mulch. It was not uncommon for entire layers to be removed and replaced, not because of cleaning custom, but because of sheer necessity. And above all this, the air hung heavy. In poorly ventilated rooms, smoke from hearths or tallow candles mixed with moisture from cooking pots and human breath. It thickened overnight, settling into fabric and hair. Clothes never felt truly dry. Wool might warm, but it also held water with surprising tenacity. Linen shirts, once worn, took on the faint, persistent scent of earth and fire. No one expected to smell fresh. They expected to endure. In wealthier households, tapestries were hung on walls, not just for beauty or insulation, but to absorb some of the damp and spare the plaster beneath. Curtains were drawn across beds to trap warmth, but they also trapped moisture. In closets and storage chests, clothing might be wrapped in layers of linen, but even so, mildew crept in during long winters. Books, rare and precious, were prone to swelling and curling if left too near exterior walls. Moisture was not simply unpleasant. It was damaging. Over time, it wore down furniture, warped wood, rusted tools, and encouraged the slow spread of mold. Leather softened and rotted. Iron hinges groaned. Shoes left near the door might sprout small blooms of white fuzz. And people, already vulnerable to cold, hunger, and infection, carried the chill of dampness in their bones. Joints ached. Lungs wheezed. Cuts took longer to heal. A house that could not dry out was a house that could not fully restore its inhabitants. Of course, people adapted. Fires were kept low but steady. Ash was spread in corners to absorb water. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, or tansy were laid among rushes to discourage mold and lend at least a fresher scent to the damp. In some places, bowls of salt or charcoal were set near walls to draw moisture, small, hopeful defenses. Windows, if present at all, were kept shut for warmth, opened only on rare sunny days to chase out the wet air. And still, the damp returned. In churches and castles, the story was the same. Grand halls might echo with music and feast days, but step close to the wall and you would feel the clammy breath of centuries. Cellars, naturally, were cold and damp by design. But even upper chambers bore signs of moisture, stains, flaking paint, softening mortar. Some rooms were simply abandoned in the worst seasons, allowed to molder in silence until spring brought back the sun. In poems and prayers, people spoke of fire, of bread, of light. Rarely did they name the damp. It was too ordinary, too persistent, and yet, it shaped daily life in quiet, fundamental ways. Clothing was chosen not just for warmth, but for what would dry most easily by the hearth. Meals were planned around what could be stored without spoiling. Beds were moved slightly away from the walls, if space allowed. And some nights, people simply endured, pulling their cloaks tighter, turning toward the fire, and hoping that tomorrow would bring even a brief dryness in the air. Over time, as building materials improved and chimneys replaced smoky hearths, homes grew drier. Glass windows, floorboards, and raised foundations helped keep the moisture at bay. But the memory of damp lingered. Even today, in some old buildings, the air still smells faintly of centuries past, of wood that has drawn in the breath of thousands of damp mornings and has never quite exhaled. So when you walk through an ancient cottage or rest in a stone church and feel that cold, earthy smell, know that you are meeting something that shaped lives for generations. The endless damp was not dramatic. It did not shout. But it was always there, wearing people down season by season, softening the edges of their world. In the rhythm of their lives, survival was not always about great battles or grand gestures. Sometimes, it was about enduring the slow, quiet forces. The ones that arrived not with thunder, but with mist. The ones that didn't destroy, but wore away. Struggling with chronic aches from hard labor and cold floors, the rooster's call came before the sky had fully shifted. A dim gray filtered through the cracks in the shutters, barely enough to see by. But it was time, always time. The fire had to be coaxed back to life. The bread turned. The animals fed. And so the day began, in the dark, as it so often did. In the medieval and early modern world, labor was not something one chose, nor something one could schedule around comfort or weather. It was simply the condition of life. To live meant to work, and to work meant to endure a body that was never quite well. Imagine yourself waking on a winter morning in a small timber-framed house. The floor beneath you is packed earth or cold stone. If you were fortunate, a bit of straw lies beneath your blanket. But the chill has settled into your bones overnight. As you shift, pain hums through your lower back. Your knees resist motion, your fingers are stiff from the cold. And yet, you rise. Because everyone must. Daily toil began not with breakfast or planning, but with movement. A slow, sore motion from bed to fire, from fire to field or shed or kitchen. For the laboring classes, peasants, artisans, servants, and many others, this rhythm was constant. There were no holidays from pain, and few tasks that could be done sitting down. The human body, though resilient, does not take kindly to years of repetition without rest. Backs bent under sacks of grain, loads of firewood, water jugs hauled from streams. Knees bore the weight of squatting, planting, scrubbing, lifting. Hands worked without gloves, kneading dough, turning soil, plucking chickens, pounding flax, gripping tools. By middle age, if one reached it, these parts of the body had begun to rebel. Chronic pain was not discussed in the way we understand it today. But it was lived, quietly, constantly. You can find its echo in the bones of archaeological remains. Vertebrae worn down, joints inflamed, finger bones deformed from repeated strain. Few ever knew a day without discomfort. It simply became the background hum of existence. And yet life went on. A farmer might limp to the fields, shoulder aching, but still bind sheaves of wheat. A washerwoman might wince as she knelt at the icy riverbank, but still scrub garments against a board. A carpenter might feel the pull in his elbow with every swing of the mallet, but the beams still needed to be set. The cold made everything worse. Floors were rarely insulated. Stone and earth held the chill long after the fire burned low. Morning duties were done with fingers too numb to grasp properly. And when rain came, as it often did in temperate regions, it seeped into joints and clothing alike. There was no concept of ergonomic tools, no medical leave, and few options for rest. Pain management, if it could be called that, came in modest forms. a warm compress from herbs boiled on the stove, a poultice of mustard seed or goose fat, a sip of beer or cider, not for pleasure but for dulling the edges. Occasionally, a village healer might offer tinctures, infused oils, vinegar steeped with willow bark, or prayers spoken over the afflicted part. But most simply endured. Rest for many was a luxury. Even in sickness, there were mouths to feed, fires to tend. The elderly who could no longer labor were often cared for by the younger, but even they might be asked to spin wool, pluck feathers, or watch children. Total stillness was rare, and often a sign that death was close. And yet, within these hardships, a certain rhythm took shape. Bodies learned to move differently. Tasks were shared when possible. Tools adapted in small ways to the hands that held them. And in the evenings, when the day's labor finally eased, there was sometimes companionship. A shared bench by the fire, calloused hands wrapped around a mug, soft murmurs of voices resting in the same weariness. This wasn't suffering in the theatrical sense. It was quieter, normalized, part of the texture of life. Pain came with the weather, like frost or fog. It was expected. Children, too, joined early. By the age of 6 or 7, they helped with chores, carrying kindling, watching animals, or assisting in the fields. Their backs stooped young. Their feet calloused early. Many grew into adulthood already marked by the slow accumulation of labor's toll. And yet, many found pride in endurance. The ability to carry, to till, to make and mend became its own strength. There was no reward waiting at the end, no retirement, no pension, but there was survival. A roof, perhaps a bit of land. And for some, the knowledge that their pain had kept others warm, fed, or clothed. The elite classes, of course, lived differently. While not entirely free from discomfort, their lives were shaped by comfort. Cushioned chairs, warm chambers, meals served by others. They might complain of ailments, gout, melancholy, or digestive woes, but their bodies were not bent from years of hauling or kneeling. Their pain was different. It came from leisure, not labor. But for the vast majority, especially in rural and working communities, pain was simply folded into the day. It shaped posture. It slowed steps. It lived in the quiet grunts as someone lifted a pail, or in the sigh as they sat at last on a wooden stool. And still, the next morning, they rose again. So imagine yourself now in that narrow bed, the air cold, your muscles aching from the day before. The light has not yet reached the horizon, but already you hear the movement of others, the stirring of coals, the creak of the door, the groan of beams beneath shifting feet. You rise, because you must, because they did, and you begin again. Fighting fleas and lice that infested bedding and hair, the fire has burned low. The last candle sputters in its dish. The hour is late, and the household, from cook to chambermaid to lord himself, has retired to sleep. Outside the air is still, but inside, under the heavy weight of woolen blankets and linen sheets, the quiet is not so complete, because the scratching has begun again. No matter your station, no matter your title, there were certain things you could not escape in the medieval and early modern world. Among them fleas, and the itch they brought with them, an invisible, ceaseless company that settled in the folds of cloth, the seams of bedding, the roots of hair. Even lords scratched in private. The battle against these small intruders was not dramatic. It was not glorious. It was instead a slow, constant effort, more weary than fierce. A daily rhythm of brushing, beating, boiling, and hoping. An acknowledgement that life, however exalted, was never quite clean. Most homes, regardless of size, were alive with warmth and movement. Fireplaces smoldered through the night. Layers of cloth padded the furniture. Straw, feathers, and wool lined the beds. And in these materials, especially in the warmth of shared spaces, small creatures thrived. Lice preferred the scalp and body. Fleas, the cracks in floorboards, the hems of garments, and the deep folds of bedding. Neither was easy to remove. Both were understood, accepted, and, when possible, temporarily repelled. Let us begin with the bed. A bed in the 14th or 15th century might consist of a wooden frame, a canvas or rope base, and several layers of padding. A thick mattress stuffed with straw or wool, a feather bed for softness, sheets of linen, woolen blankets, and perhaps a coverlet. A well-made bed was warm and heavy, but each layer offered shelter to more than just the sleeper. Beating the bedding was a weekly and often daily task. Sheets were taken out and shaken hard in the yard. Blankets were hung from beams and struck with wooden rods to dislodge dust and unwelcome inhabitants. Mattresses might be opened at the seams and restuffed, especially if the contents had soured. Still, the fleas came back. In warmer months, beds might be sprinkled with herbs thought to repel insects. Lavender, rosemary, pennyroyal. Dried bundles were tucked between sheets or under pillows. Some households scattered fresh rushes on the floor and changed them regularly to mask odors and discourage crawling pests. But again, the relief was brief. Hair, too, required vigilance. Combs with fine, narrow teeth were used to drag lice from the scalp. The process was slow, often painful, and deeply familiar. Mothers combed daughters. Servants combed their mistresses. And in some cases, lords and kings relied on trusted attendants to do the same. It was not scandalous. It was maintenance. Oils were sometimes used, olive oil, goose fat, even vinegar, to loosen the hold of lice on the hair shaft. Afterward, the hair was wrapped in cloth to suffocate any remaining creatures, and the combing resumed the next morning. But again, few believed it would be the end. Clothing, particularly undergarments and bedclothes, were boiled when possible. Not all fabrics could withstand it, but linen, common for shifts and shirts, could be scalded, scrubbed, and hung to dry in the sun. The heat helped. The light helped. And yet, the scratching returned. It is worth noting that cleanliness was not ignored in the past. People did wash, though not in the ways we expect. Full immersion baths were rare for many, but hands, faces, and feet were washed daily. Clothes were changed and laundered when possible. Hair was trimmed, combed, and occasionally dusted with powders made from ground herbs or chalk. Still, the infestation persisted. One reason for this was simple: proximity. Most people, especially the poor, slept closely together. Entire families might share one bed or one room. Blankets were reused, handed down, traded, and never truly free from what lived inside them. Even among the wealthy, infestation was not proof of filth. It was simply expected. Kings kept fur-lined robes, feathered pillows, and velvet canopies, all havens for the biting, crawling creatures that favored warmth and dark. A monarch might rise from a gold-embroidered bed and still spend the morning scratching discreetly behind the ear. There were other strategies. Some wore sachets of camphor or vinegar-soaked cloth around their necks. Others hung herbs above the bed. Folk healers offered potions or salves. These were sometimes effective, but rarely for long. The infestation, once interrupted, simply found another time or place to return. And so, over time, the presence of fleas and lice became part of the lived texture of life. Not pleasant, not ignored, but woven in. A nuisance that marked the skin, interrupted sleep, and humbled even the most powerful. A quiet reminder that in the grand ladder of life, all were made to itch. Some found humor in it. Poets wrote of flea bites as metaphors for love or desire. Children competed to catch the largest louse. And storytellers whispered of spirits that disguised themselves as biting insects to punish pride. But beneath the jokes and folk tales was the simple reality. To be alive, to be warm, to be close to others, was to be vulnerable to tiny, persistent company. So tonight, as you lie beneath your own blankets, clean, perhaps, and soft in a way the past could not imagine, know that sleep was never so easy once. That in those quiet, fire-lit rooms, where the scratching stirred long after the last voice had gone quiet, people lived and endured, scratched and combed, beat and boiled, and every morning began again, living with the unspoken fear of a poor harvest. Imagine standing in the middle of a wheat field at dusk. The heads of grain sway gently in the breeze, their soft rustling the only sound for miles. The light is low, and the air is thick with the scent of dry earth and fading sun. There's a hush here, not of peace exactly, but of waiting, watching, worrying. For most of history, To live on the land was to live with a question always just beneath the surface. Will it be enough? From spring to summer, from autumn to frost, the lives of rural people turned on that single, fragile uncertainty. The harvest was not just an event, it was a hope, a risk, a silent prayer carved into every furrow and seed. Unlike the storms that arrived suddenly or the illnesses that struck without warning, the fear of a poor harvest grew slowly. It was patient. It began in small moments, when rain fell too long or not long enough, when the frost lingered too late or arrived too soon, when pests appeared at the edge of a field, when animals stopped feeding well, or when a neighbor mentioned that his barley wasn't growing as it should. There were no forecasts, no long-range predictions. Farmers read the sky, listened to birdsong, studied the curl of leaves and the weight of clouds. But in the end, they waited and worried. And when that worry deepened into shortage, it rarely announced itself loudly. There was no immediate collapse, no dramatic moment. Just a slow thinning. A little less bread on the table. A little more water in the stew. Children sent to bed without asking for seconds. A quiet rationing that began long before anyone admitted it aloud. In villages across medieval and early modern Europe, the harvest was more than an agricultural milestone. It was the hinge upon which the rest of the year turned. A good harvest meant survival, trade, celebration. The poor one meant hunger, tension, and sometimes disappearance. Even a minor failure could echo for months. Grain prices rose. Seed stock diminished. Men and women walked farther to find work or barter. The animals were culled earlier than planned. Nothing drastic, not at first. Just little shifts. But behind every shift was the same fear. What if winter lasts too long? This fear was rarely spoken outright. It sat unmentioned at the edge of daily life, showing itself in gestures more than words. A mother saving a crust instead of eating it. A father checking the root cellar twice in one day. A neighbor reluctant to share her stores, though she might have in better years. And there was shame in it too. To admit fear of a failed harvest was to admit vulnerability. Better, many thought, to say nothing, to tighten the belt, to keep working, to carry on. Communities had coping rituals, some practical, others spiritual. In early spring, processions were held to bless the fields. Statues of saints were carried through the rows of growing wheat. Rain was prayed for, then later, sun. In especially hard years, a village might perform the rogation days with greater intensity, walking the bounds of the land, asking for mercy, for yield. Old superstitions also emerged, blending into the year's rhythm. A strange stone found in the soil might be kept for luck. The first sheaf cut might be saved, tucked above the hearth, never touched. Some swore that a crooked row meant crooked fortune. Others tied charms to trees or muttered old phrases under their breath when sowing seeds. But still, none of it guaranteed anything. There were years when the fields looked strong in July, only to rot from blight in August. When rains arrived too soon and flattened the crop. When hail fell and shredded everything in minutes. And then came the calculations. How much could be saved? What could be traded? How long the stores might last if everyone ate just a little less? And what made it harder was this. One poor harvest was bad. But two in a row could unravel the fabric of an entire village. With too little to go around, tempers frayed. Rumors spread. Those with more were watched closely. Theft increased, at night, in the corners of barns, from sacks thought safely stored. And sometimes, quietly, a family left. Disappeared into the road, hoping to find better luck elsewhere. The fear of famine wasn't just about empty bellies. It was about empty futures. About losing the next planting season. About selling tools or animals just to survive the present. And when that happened, recovery could take years. Even in times of relative abundance, the memory of bad years lingered. Old women remembered the winter of ash bread, when flour was stretched with bark. Men recalled walking 10 miles for a sack of oats. And so even in good harvests, people stored more than they needed. They salted, smoked, and dried. They dug deeper cellars. They saved the seed grain with care. Because they knew next year might not be kind. And through it all, the rhythm of the seasons continued. The barley still ripened. The sides still cut. The granary still filled, or didn't. And life adjusted around whatever came. Today, we think of harvest as quaint. A festival. A time of pumpkins and bonfires and bounty. But for most of history, it was a quiet gamble. A long, slow drawing of lots against the weather, the soil, the sky. And in that waiting, in that soft, persistent fear, entire cultures shape themselves. So if you ever walk a country path in late summer and see golden fields leaning toward the sun, pause for a moment. Listen to the hush. The breeze. The rustle. That stillness you feel? That's the weight of generations, all asking the same question. Will it be enough this time? Managing waste in courtyards where children played. Imagine a small, enclosed courtyard at the rear of a medieval home. The ground is packed earth, firm in some places, damp and uneven in others. Stone walls rise around it, patched here and there with wood or wattle, and beyond them are the soft sounds of village life. A cartwheel turning, a distant bell, a dog barking once and then falling silent. This space is neither private nor public. Not quite inside, not truly out. And here, between the kitchen door and the edge of the garden, is where much of daily life unfolds. Children play here. Not with toys in the modern sense, but with whatever the space provides. Sticks, pebbles, scraps of fabric tied into knots. A hen clucks nearby, scratching at the soil. And there, not far from the kitchen door, is a shallow pit lined with the darker shade of soil that says, "This is where waste goes." In the medieval world, managing waste was not a separate or sanitary process. It was part of the rhythm of living. What couldn't be reused or fed to animals was often tossed into refuse pits, sometimes called midden heaps, positioned just outside the kitchen or rear door. These pits were not deep, not sealed, not distant. They were accessible and deliberately so. Convenience often outweighed any other concern. Ashes from the hearth, bones from meals, spoiled food, broken pottery, bits of cloth, all of it found its way into the pit. And over time, as one heap grew unsightly or full, another would be begun beside it. The soil darkened. The smells changed with the seasons, more pungent in the heat, more tolerable in the frost. But the pit was always there. A quiet necessity. Cleanliness, in this context, was not about sterility. It was about degrees. About keeping the inside cleaner than the outside. About keeping what spoiled at a manageable distance, but not so far that it interfered with the daily labor of cooking, fetching water, tending animals, and raising children. The rain was a mixed blessing. A light drizzle might tamp down the dust and wash some of the waste into the soil. But heavy rains turned the earth to mud, and that mud did not distinguish between play space and disposal site. Runoff from the midden could seep into paths worn down by bare feet, human and animal alike. Chickens pecked at what was discarded. Pigs, when permitted to roam, rooted through the mess with ease. Dogs nosed their way into everything. And the children, of course, were everywhere. There were attempts, some conscious, some instinctive, to create order. A plank might be laid across the worst of the wet ground. Stones might be placed as stepping points. Water was used to rinse hands and faces, especially before meals. In some households, straw or rushes were scattered across the courtyard to soak up the damp. These weren't solutions in the modern sense, but adjustments. Ways of living within the limits of what was possible. And while it may seem shocking now, the people of the time did not view this as filth in the way we do. Waste was expected, managed, redirected, not eliminated. The hearth produced ash, the body produced refuse, the meal produced scraps. And all of it returned to the soil eventually. The courtyard, in this way, was a small and constant cycle of life and decay. In towns and denser settlements, local laws occasionally attempted to regulate waste disposal. Citizens were sometimes fined for dumping refuse too close to shared wells or common paths. Regulations might designate certain corners of the yard for waste or ban specific materials. But enforcement was uneven and practicality often won. If the pit was close to the door, it was easier to use. If it was easier to use, it was used more often. Children growing up in these spaces learned early how to navigate them. They knew which patches to avoid after rain. They learned, from observation, what not to touch. Illness did come, diarrhea, fever, rashes, but it was rarely traced to a single source. Disease was seen as misfortune, not the result of unseen organisms. And so the waste remained, managed not by elimination, but by familiarity. Clothing helped in its way. Children often went barefoot, but their tunics were simple and easy to wash. A soiled garment was rinsed, dried by the hearth, and worn again. Tools used to stir waste, sticks, shovels, scraps of board, were used and discarded without ceremony. And despite it all, life continued. Meals were prepared just steps from the waste. Stories were told while chickens strutted across the yard. Children played tag in narrow paths between pits. The smells and sights of decay did not overwhelm the day, they were simply part of it. There were advantages, too, in the long view. Archaeologists today rely heavily on these midden pits. They preserve a remarkable record of medieval life. From the waste of centuries, we learn what was eaten, what tools were used, what games were played. Scraps of parchment, charred seeds, broken toys. All cast off, but never forgotten. And so, imagine the courtyard once more. The fire inside has dimmed to embers. A pot rests beside the door, cooling in the night air. The rain has passed, leaving damp footprints in the earth. A child's laughter lingers, though the child is now asleep. The refuse pit sits quietly, its contents shifting slowly in the dark. Not hidden, not ignored, simply there. A part of the home as much as the hearth or the roof. A place where what is no longer needed goes to rest. And tomorrow, the rhythm will begin again. Keeping warm with fires that filled rooms with smoke. Imagine stepping inside a small home on a winter evening. The light is low, golden, flickering. A fire burns at the center of the room, its orange glow dancing across the walls. The warmth is real, immediate and welcome, but the air is thick. It clings to your eyes, stings the back of your throat. You blink. You cough quietly. And you realize there is no chimney. In many homes of the past, warmth came at a cost. For centuries, across rural Europe and beyond, the open hearth was the heart of the home, but it was also its burden. Fires burned on simple stone bases or dug out earth in the middle of the floor, with no flue, no outlet, no separation between heat and haze. The smoke curled upward and spread, seeking the ceiling beams, seeping into thatch, clinging to clothes, and settling into lungs. Chimneys, true chimneys, were an innovation that arrived slowly and unevenly. Even by the 14th and 15th centuries, many households still relied on what were called smoke lofts or smoke bays, open rafters where the smoke could gather and drift, sometimes escaping through a hole in the roof or a high window, if the wind allowed. But in the meantime, it lingered. It always lingered. Walls darkened over time, coated in a film of soot that dulled the paint and aged the wood. Children grew up beneath beams that had turned black from decades of rising smoke. Even well-kept homes smelled faintly of ash and char. The scent was not offensive, it was simply part of the air, as ordinary as the sound of the fire crackling or the creak of the floorboards. The benefits of the fire were undeniable. It gave light, it warmed the body, it dried clothing and kept food from spoiling. Pots hung from hooks above the flames, and the day's meals, broths, porridges, stews, simmered slowly in the heat. But the drawbacks followed close behind. Breathing was never entirely easy. Smoke irritated eyes, rasped in the throat, and nestled deep in the chest. Over time, the damage accumulated. Chronic coughing, wheezing, and a general heaviness in the lungs were simply part of life. Infants and the elderly were especially vulnerable. A baby's cradle might be kept near the hearth for warmth, but also directly in the path of the smoke. Grandparents might wrap themselves in layers and sit closest to the flame, drawing comfort from the heat, even as the smoke slowly narrowed their breath. No one called it illness. It was just the cost of staying alive in winter. To make the conditions more bearable, homes developed certain patterns. Doors were cracked open, even in cold weather, to create a draft. Roof holes were angled to favor prevailing winds. Fires were built low and slow, not roaring, to reduce excess smoke. And in some households, a kind of indoor layering emerged. Different heights and corners of the room had slightly better air. Children might lie closer to the ground, where the smoke was thinnest. Adults learned to work with stinging eyes. Clothing absorbed it all. Hair smelled of it. Bedding took it in. The smoke became part of the fabric of life, not just metaphorically, but literally. Visitors could tell the richness of a home not just by its size or furnishings, but by its air. A house with a chimney offered a different kind of breath, a luxury of lightness many could scarcely imagine. Chimneys, when they came, were transformative. At first, they were simple stone funnels built into walls, leading up and out. They allowed the hearth to stay lit longer, with less smoke hanging in the room. Air cleared more quickly, and rooms grew slightly brighter. But they were expensive to build and maintain. Stone had to be shaped, mortar sealed. Even then, drafts were common, and soot could build into dangerous clogs. Chimney sweeps emerged as a profession. Usually boys, sent up the narrow shafts to knock loose the blackened buildup with brushes and scraped hands. But long before chimneys were common, people made do. In castles, fire was often centralized in great halls with massive vents in the roof. The high ceilings allowed smoke to rise, but it still filtered down over time, sinking slowly into tapestries and garments. In monasteries, clever flues and vents were sometimes built into stonework, but even these were limited, and many monks warmed their hands by fires that blurred the edges of the page they were copying. In smaller homes, the hearth remained humble. Stones were rearranged to improve draw. Gaps in the walls served as makeshift chimneys. Some even placed straw bundles above the hearth to trap soot before it spread, primitive but effective for a time. Still, the air remained heavy. The cultural memory of these smoky spaces lived on. Even in later centuries, when chimneys became common and coal fires replaced open hearths, the association between warmth and smoke lingered. Smoke meant safety. Smoke meant food was cooking, the fire was alive, the family had not fled. Even today, the smell of a wood-burning fire stirs something old in the mind, something that remembers long nights huddled close, trading clear air for heat. So when you imagine life in an old cottage, or the lower chamber of a medieval inn, don't picture a clean, crisp firelight like in a painting. Picture the smoke rising in slow ribbons, twisting through rafters, tracing its mark across the face of the person nearest the flame. Picture warmth, yes, but not comfort in the modern sense. It was a negotiation, a balance. In the rhythm of their lives, warmth was earned, and breathing was the price. They didn't complain. They simply lived inside the haze. Fetching water from wells that froze solid in winter, imagine a morning so still that even the birds have not begun to stir. Frost creeps up the windows, pale and breath-like, tracing delicate veins across the glass. The air in the room feels closer to outside than in. You draw in a breath, and it stings the lungs gently, sharp and cold. The fire has burned low in the night. Embers sleep under ash. And somewhere beyond the door, the water waits. In the world before indoor plumbing, before taps and faucets, before pipes and radiators, water was not something one fetched casually. It was earned. It was sought. And in the depths of winter, it was often fought for. Each household had its own source. A shared village well, a nearby spring, a narrow stream tucked beyond a tree-line, or, if fortunate, a private well near the back door. But all had one thing in common. When the cold came early and stayed late, those sources did not always yield freely. In the warmer months, fetching water was already laborious. It meant walking, lifting, balancing. A journey made several times a day, often by women and children. But in winter, that labor hardened into something slower, heavier. A daily trial not just of strength, but of patience, of resilience, and of need. Imagine a well in the middle of a village square. The stones surrounding it are glazed with ice, slick underfoot. The rope, thick with moisture, has frozen stiff. It no longer coils with ease but creaks and resists, like an old joint. Your gloves, if you have any, are stiff too, wool-soaked and crusted at the edges. You lower the bucket, inch by inch. The pulley complains. Throat jerks. And then, a dull sound. The bucket meets not water, but ice. Many wells froze only at the top, just a thick crust, inches deep. A blow with a rod or a hammer might break it. But in harsher winters, especially in northern climates, the freeze crept deeper. Buckets stuck fast, or bounced off a surface too hard to break. Some families kept a metal bar nearby, just for this purpose. It wasn't elegant work. It was cold and loud and tiring. But it was necessary, because thirst did not wait for the thaw. Each household needed water for drinking, for cooking, for washing what little could be washed in winter. Animals needed it too, and their troughs froze quickly. So even after the first haul, another might be needed, and another. In the countryside, streams and ponds offered alternative sources. But walking to them in snow was treacherous. The surface often appeared stable, until it wasn't. Stories circulated of those who stepped too far, who slipped beneath the surface, who vanished under the ice. So people tested carefully. A stick, a stone, a careful footstep. And if they reached the water's edge safely, they still had to break it open. Sometimes each day. The burden of this labor often fell to the same few. A girl of 12 might carry a bucket nearly half her weight. A mother might rise before dawn to fetch enough water for bread making. An older man might guard the well with quiet attentiveness, reminding others to wrap the rope when not in use, to keep the pulley from splitting. In some homes, barrels or jugs were kept inside by the hearth to keep water from freezing. But space was limited, and any reserve was quickly used. Others melted snow, but this was slow and inefficient. Snow took time to collect. It yielded little water, and its purity was never guaranteed. Ash from the chimney often mixed with the snow near the home, darkening it with soot. Sometimes the well wasn't just frozen, it was broken. A stone shifted, a pulley snapped, the bucket cracked under the stress. In these moments, neighbors relied on each other. One family's spring might become a village lifeline, and the trek grew longer. But refusal was rare. In the face of shared hardship, there was often quiet cooperation. There were superstitions too. Some believed that breaking the ice too roughly might anger spirits dwelling in the well. Others thought the first water drawn each day had special properties, healing, protective, or even prophetic. It was common in some places to sprinkle the first ladleful at the threshold, or to cross oneself before drinking it. Not because they expected magic, but because water, in winter, was something close to sacred. And when the ice finally melted, when spring softened the air and the rope moved smoothly again, it felt like a kind of miracle. No one cheered. No songs were sung. But there was relief. A quiet lifting of the season's weight. The labor remained, but the resistance eased. Today, we twist a tap and hear a flow. We drink without thinking. But not long ago, water was a daily test. It chilled the fingers. It bent the back. It stole minutes and hours and warmth. It made every sip a small act of survival. So imagine again that morning. The lights still dim, the ground hard. A figure approaches the well, breath visible in the air, bucket swinging gently from a gloved hand. The rope is stiff. The crank turns slowly. But the ice will give, eventually. It always does. And with a little luck, there will be water enough. For porridge, for tea, for the quiet endurance of another winter day. Watching food spoil before it could be eaten, imagine standing in a dimly lit storeroom, stone walls cool to the touch, lined with wooden shelves and baskets woven tight. The smell is a mix of dried herbs, earthen floor, and something more uncertain, the faint, sour edge of milk turned too soon, or a soft sweetness that signals fruit gone past its best. This is the household's food supply. Carefully gathered, painfully stored, and slowly, inevitably, some of it is going bad. In the world before refrigeration, before pasteurization, before the chemical preservatives that now extend the life of even the humblest snack, food was not a guarantee. It was a race against time, a gamble, a daily observation of what could be eaten and what, despite all effort, was already lost. Even the best prepared larders held uncertainty. Salted meat, for example, was a staple of survival. Pork or beef was packed in layers of coarse salt, set in barrels or hung in dry air. The salt drew out moisture, slowed decay. But it was never permanent. Salt could only reach so far. If the meat was not turned, if the brine was not refreshed, if a mouse found its way in, or if dampness crept up from the ground, the spoilage began, from within and slowly. When a cask was opened, there was always the quiet moment of inspection. A smell, a press of the finger. The texture told as much as the color. If too soft, too slick, too dark at the edges, it meant the salt had failed. Days or weeks of work, and a vital portion of winter's meat, would have to be thrown out. Or, more often, simply endured. Milk was worse. In the best conditions, raw milk might last a day or two. In summer, perhaps just hours. It could be stored in cool cellars or lowered into wells, but even then it turned fast. Many households didn't drink milk so much as chase it through its transformations. When it soured, it became curds. When it separated, it became butter. When it spoiled entirely, it fed pigs or soaked into the soil. The souring was not always unpleasant. A fresh cream left in a stone pot overnight might become something thick and tangy by morning. But only if the balance held. Only if no foreign mold arrived to spoil the batch too soon. Flour, too, was vulnerable. It seemed dry. But in damp cupboards or poorly sealed barrels, it welcomed moisture. And with moisture came the slow bloom of mold, or worse, infestation. Weevils, tiny beetles, and moth larvae lived quietly in the folds of flour sacks, eating what people meant to eat. It wasn't always visible at first, but pour out a scoop and you might see them move. And yet, nothing was discarded lightly. In homes where food was hard-won, through hours of labor, through weather and risk and rent, waste was painful. Spoiled food was mourned, not with ceremony, but with a quiet tightening of the jaw. A smaller portion at supper, a sharper edge to tomorrow's hunger. It's easy now to think of expiration dates, sealed packages, and freezer-safe containers. But for much of human history, the rhythms of food were lived close to the bone. A pot of stew could last several days, but only if it was boiled each morning to chase off spoilage. Eggs could be preserved in ash or lime water, but the method was finicky. A single crack, and the egg turned sulfurous within hours. Fruits were eaten in season or dried for later. But dried fruit could rehydrate in humid air and begin to mold. Pickles lasted longer, but only if their brine remained strong and undisturbed. Cheese, aged carefully, was one of the few durable foods, but even it could host unwelcome guests, maggots, or mold too bitter to scrape away. And so people watched their food with the same attention we might give a ticking clock or a bank account. Every morning brought questions. Has the bread gone hard? Is the butter still good? Did something change in the smell of the root cellar? There were signs to learn. Discoloration. Softness where there should be firmness. The wrong kind of moisture. The wrong kind of silence. Even in noble households, with pantries overseen by stewards and servants, spoilage was common. It was expected. Food that traveled, even just a few miles, suffered bruises and breaks. Fish spoiled in the sun. Berries mashed themselves in baskets. Wine soured in the cask. There was only so much even wealth could do. Preservation methods helped, but they were never perfect. Smoke, salt, vinegar, honey, and cold each offered a delay, not a cure. They gave time, not certainty. And always, mouths waited to be fed. The psychological weight of spoilage cannot be underestimated. In times of want, to open a pot and find the stew gone sour was more than inconvenience. It was loss. And for children or the elderly, it might mean the difference between strength and sickness. This is why the rituals of food care were so careful. Why lids were tied down with cloth. Why cheeses were wrapped in herbs. Why jars were sealed with wax or fat. Why certain foods were placed not just on shelves, but in straw, in ash, in cool clay, anywhere that might stretch their life just a little longer. And still things spoiled. And still, families endured. There was a certain humility in it. A quiet acknowledgement that no matter how skilled the cook, how careful the housekeeper, or how fortunate the harvest, nature still held the final word. So when you picture the past, not in terms of battles or kings or grand halls, but in terms of daily life, remember the storeroom, the shelf with the single remaining loaf, the bowl covered with linen, the jar of milk gently sniffed before being poured. and the ever-present possibility that what was saved for tomorrow might already be lost. Even the most careful hands could not stop the turn, and so they watched, and waited, and learned to live with the knowledge that not all things could be preserved, that some sweetness, some nourishment, was only theirs if taken in time. Enduring hunger quietly during long fasting seasons. Imagine standing in the middle of a wheat field at dusk. The heads of grain sway gently in the breeze, their soft rustling the only sound for miles. The light is low, and the air is thick with the scent of dry earth and fading sun. There's a hush here, not of peace exactly, but of waiting, watching, worrying. For most of history, to live on the land was to live with a question always just beneath the surface. Will it be enough? From spring to summer, from autumn to frost, the lives of rural people turned on that single, fragile uncertainty. The harvest was not just an event, it was a hope, a risk, a silent prayer carved into every furrow and seed. Unlike the storms that arrived suddenly or the illnesses that struck without warning, the fear of a poor harvest grew slowly. It was patient. It began in small moments, when rain fell too long or not long enough, when the frost lingered too late or arrived too soon, when pests appeared at the edge of a field, when animals stopped feeding well, or when a neighbor mentioned that his barley wasn't growing as it should. There were no forecasts, no long-range predictions. Farmers read the sky, listened to birdsong, studied the curl of leaves and the weight of clouds. But in the end, they waited and worried. And when that worry deepened into shortage, it rarely announced itself loudly. There was no immediate collapse, no dramatic moment. Just a slow thinning. A little less bread on the table. A little more water in the stew. Children sent to bed without asking for seconds. A quiet rationing that began long before anyone admitted it aloud. In villages across medieval and early modern Europe, the harvest was more than an agricultural milestone. It was the hinge upon which the rest of the year turned. A good harvest meant survival, trade, celebration. The poor one meant hunger, tension, and sometimes disappearance. Even a minor failure could echo for months. Grain prices rose. Seed stock diminished. Men and women walked farther to find work or barter. The animals were culled earlier than planned. Nothing drastic, not at first. Just little shifts. But behind every shift was the same fear. What if winter lasts too long? This fear was rarely spoken outright. It sat unmentioned at the edge of daily life, showing itself in gestures more than words. A mother saving a crust instead of eating it. A father checking the root cellar twice in one day. A neighbor reluctant to share her stores, though she might have in better years. And there was shame in it too. To admit fear of a failed harvest was to admit vulnerability. Better, many thought, to say nothing, to tighten the belt, to keep working, to carry on. Communities had coping rituals, some practical, others spiritual. In early spring, processions were held to bless the fields. Statues of saints were carried through the rows of growing wheat. Rain was prayed for, then later, sun. In especially hard years, a village might perform the rogation days with greater intensity, walking the bounds of the land, asking for mercy, for yield. Old superstitions also emerged, blending into the year's rhythm. A strange stone found in the soil might be kept for luck. The first sheaf cut might be saved, tucked above the hearth, never touched. Some swore that a crooked row meant crooked fortune. Others tied charms to trees or muttered old phrases under their breath when sowing seeds. But still, none of it guaranteed anything. There were years when the fields looked strong in July, only to rot from blight in August. When rains arrived too soon and flattened the crop. When hail fell and shredded everything in minutes. And then came the calculations. How much could be saved? What could be traded? How long the stores might last if everyone ate just a little less? And what made it harder was this. One poor harvest was bad. But two in a row could unravel the fabric of an entire village. With too little to go around, tempers frayed. Rumors spread. Those with more were watched closely. Theft increased, at night, in the corners of barns, from sacks thought safely stored. And sometimes, quietly, a family left. disappeared into the road, hoping to find better luck elsewhere. The fear of famine wasn't just about empty bellies. It was about empty futures. About losing the next planting season. About selling tools or animals just to survive the present. And when that happened, recovery could take years. Even in times of relative abundance, the memory of bad years lingered. Old women remembered the winter of ash bread, when flour was stretched with bark. Men recalled walking 10 miles for a sack of oats. And so even in good harvests, people stored more than they needed. They salted, smoked, and dried. They dug deeper cellars. They saved the seed grain with care. Because they knew next year might not be kind. And through it all, the rhythm of the seasons continued. The barley still ripened. The scythes still cut. The granaries still filled, or didn't. And life adjusted around whatever came. Today, we think of harvest as quaint. A festival. A time of pumpkins and bonfires and bounty. But for most of history, it was a quiet gamble. A long, slow drawing of lots against the weather, the soil, the sky. And in that waiting, in that soft, persistent fear, entire cultures shaped themselves. So if you ever walk a country path in late summer and see golden fields leaning toward the sun, pause for a moment. Listen to the hush. The breeze, the rustle, that stillness you feel? That's the weight of generations, all asking the same question. Will it be enough this time? Navigating paths that became rivers of mud, imagine a narrow track winding between fields, its edges softened by grass and moss, its surface uneven and worn by generations of feet, hooves, and wheels. The path stretches ahead through low hedgerows and rising mist. You can picture the trees bowing gently on either side, and beyond them, the gray sky beginning to gather itself for rain. At first, it's only a drizzle, a steady patter on wool hoods and canvas cart covers. But soon it deepens. The air thickens. The drops grow heavier, and the earth responds, softening, swelling, drinking it in. What was once a firm track begins to change. Its top layer loosens. The familiar grooves made by wagons begin to vanish, replaced by uncertain hollows. This is the road now, a stretch of earth slowly surrendering to water. In the medieval world, most roads were not paved or maintained in any consistent way. Especially in rural regions, paths between villages or towns were often nothing more than packed dirt, trodden by people and livestock. In dry weather, they were dusty, cracked, and uneven. But in wet weather, which was often, they became something else entirely. Slow, deep, and unpredictable. Rain transformed the road into a kind of obstacle. Mud rose in thick sheets, clinging to shoes and wheel rims, collecting in unexpected dips. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to lose a shoe entirely, sucked off by the earth, never to be seen again. A single misstep might plunge a foot ankle deep, or worse. And those pushing carts or wagons often found themselves stopped mid-journey, the wheels mired in sludge that clung with a quiet, sticky resistance. Progress on such roads was always uncertain. There was no timetable, no guaranteed arrival. A trip of 10 miles might stretch into an all-day affair, or be abandoned entirely. Horses struggled, slipping and balking. Oxen sank slowly under the strain. Carts leaned dangerously to one side, their axles buried halfway down into sodden soil. Travelers, too, adapted. Some walked with long staves, not for defense, but for balance. Others tied rags around their legs or smeared them in tallow to keep out the cold and wet. Most simply endured it, each step a test, each mile an act of patience. There were no true maps to these changes. The road shifted with every rain. What was firm yesterday might be impassable today. And so, locals developed their own knowledge, landmarks, slight rises in the ground, places where the stone beneath the soil gave some advantage. But even this knowledge had limits. The land was not always cooperative. In some areas, wooden planks or bundles of brush were laid across particularly bad stretches, temporary fixings known as corduroy roads. These helped a little, but they were often swallowed by the mud over time, or became as slippery as the ground itself. And still, people walked them. Because they had to. The market waited. A message needed delivery. A field, a festival, a funeral. For those living near the roads, the change in weather brought more than inconvenience. It brought noise. The squelch of passing animals, the creak of stuck wheels, the shouts of travelers calling for help. Courtyard gates stayed open longer in the rain, not out of hospitality, but out of practicality. Someone might need a place to clean their boots, warm their hands, or wait for the downpour to pass. And yet, even as the roads turned to bog, life continued. Merchants trudged on, their sacks lifted higher on their backs. Messengers dismounted and led their horses on foot. Pilgrims leaned on one another, robes soaked through, sandals heavy. No one expected ease. The road had its moods, and people traveled accordingly. The fear wasn't just in the mud, but in what it might hide. Deep ruts could twist ankles. Hidden stones could shatter wheels. In places where the track crossed low-lying fields or riverbanks, the road itself might vanish entirely, replaced by standing water that masked its depth and shape. Travelers sometimes waited for others to pass first, watching to see where they stumbled. Shoes, when worn, were practical. Thick-soled, strapped tight, made of leather that had been worn soft by years of walking. But they were not immune. Many walked barefoot instead, preferring the feel of the mud to the loss of a precious shoe. It wasn't just the rural roads. Even in towns, the narrow lanes between buildings could become small rivers. Refuse flowed with the rain. Wooden walkways, where they existed, offered only brief relief. Many preferred to walk along the edges, balancing on foundation stones or using the walls themselves for support. Children, naturally, found play in the mess. They jumped puddles, tested the thickness of the mud with sticks, sometimes fell in entirely and returned home streaked and laughing, though not always met with amusement. For adults, the path was less forgiving. And so, you can imagine the rhythm of these roads. Slow, slogging. Travelers hunched forward, boots dragging, cartwheels half submerged. The rain falls steady, then stops. The wind returns. And behind each figure, a set of footprints, half erased by the next gust, the next step. There's a certain quiet resilience in this image. Not one of glory or hardship, but of routine perseverance. The road is muddy. It always is. You walk it anyway. And the next day, you do it again. Losing precious time waiting on unreliable sunlight. Imagine waking with the dawn, not because of an alarm or a rooster, but because light, quite simply, is your only guide. The faint gray that seeps through the cracks in the shutters is your cue to begin. You rise quickly, while you can still see clearly enough to dress, to stoke the fire, to prepare the day's first tasks. Because already the clock is ticking, and that clock is the sky. In the pre-industrial world, sunlight was everything. It marked the start and end of labor. It shaped the pace of a household's survival. But sunlight, as it turns out, is not always reliable. Cloudy days, fog, sudden rain, any of these could steal hours from a life that depended on everyone. For those without candles, rushlights, or oil lamps, and that included a great many people, particularly the poor, the setting sun brought more than darkness. It brought a full stop. Tools were laid down not by choice, but by necessity. A seamstress could no longer thread her needle. A cooper could not shape his barrels. A child learning letters had to close the slate and wait for morning. Candles were not absent from daily life, but they were rationed, guarded, reserved for need. A tallow candle, with its smoky flame and unpleasant scent, was a luxury of sorts. Even a family that could afford to make them might save them for holy days or urgent tasks. Rushlights, thin stalks of dried reed dipped in animal fat, were cheaper and more common, but burned unevenly and dimly. A single rushlight might last half an hour, flickering and sputtering with every breeze. And so, most work was done in daylight. And when daylight failed early, so did the work. This meant that a cloudy afternoon could reshape the rhythm of a household. Washing left half done. Looms silenced. Spindles stilled. In larger homes, servants clustered near windows, angling their bodies to catch what little light they could. In poorer cottages, where the windows were small and unglazed, entire afternoons might be lost if the weather turned. Time itself became fragile. Days were not neatly divided into hours, but into usable and unusable segments. Morning fog might push back the start of work. An early dusk might shave away evening labor. A stretch of cloudy days could delay vital tasks, mending clothes, repairing tools, even preparing food. Winter, with its short daylight, was the most difficult. The sun might rise late, set early, and bring little brightness in between. Some adapted. Outdoor work was prioritized even in cold weather, if the sky was clear. Indoor chores were saved for the rain. Children learned early to work quickly when light was good. And still, people waited, sitting quietly, peering through cracks in the sky, watching for a patch of brightness to return. The waiting was not restful. It was tinged with frustration, anxiety, and, at times, resignation. A spinning wheel idle for lack of light meant thread undone. A farmer unable to sort seed by I meant planting postponed. For households already living near the edge, lost time meant real risk. A delay in mending a cloak could mean exposure to cold. A delay in preparing winter stores could mean hunger weeks later. And yet, they bore it. Not with ease, but with a kind of practiced patience. Life had always been this way. There was no expectation of control, only of endurance. In monasteries, the rhythm of sunlight shaped the very structure of prayer and labor. Monks rose before dawn and worked in cycles defined not by clocks, but by the turning of the sky. A cloudy day shifted the tone of an entire cloister, just as it did a cottage or a workshop. In cities, the problem remained. Even in narrow streets bustling with trade, light was a fickle companion. Buildings cast long shadows. Smoke from chimneys dulled the sky. Merchants opened their stalls early, hoping to complete sales before visibility faded. Tailors and cobblers dragged benches closer to windows. The wealthiest might burn oil lamps, but for most, poor light meant delay. Over time, people developed small tricks. White cloth was laid beneath sewing to reflect what light there was. Tools were sharpened by touch and memory. Some learned to squint, to guess, to adapt. But there were limits. Human eyes, even trained ones, cannot force clarity where light does not allow. It was not only labor that suffered. Leisure, too, vanished with the sun. Reading, writing, embroidery, these were pleasures bound to illumination. Conversation took its place. Storytelling, the quiet work of tending the fire. These moments had their own beauty, but they were often the result of limitation, not luxury. Today, when night falls, we flick a switch without thinking. The glow is immediate, steady, and impartial to weather. But in that earlier world, the darkness was personal. It decided what could be done and when. And so the sky became not just a backdrop, but a ruler. People watched it like a timepiece, praying for light, dreading its retreat. So the next time you find yourself indoors on a rainy afternoon, lights flickering on to chase the gray, think of those who once waited, hands folded, work unfinished, watching the sky in silence. Their time was not measured by numbers, but by the rhythm of clouds and sun. And in the rhythm of their lives, every hour of light was a gift. Every lost hour a quiet theft. The sky was both their calendar and their clock, and it did not always keep its promises. Caring for the sick without hope of cure, the hearth glows softly in the corner, though the flames burn low. Shadows stretch long across the room, flickering gently across the beams overhead. On a rough-hewn bed lies someone breathing slowly. Not evenly. Not well. A cough rattles up from the lungs. A sheen of sweat clings to the brow. You sit beside them, holding a cloth dampened with water from the well. There is little more to do. In centuries past, illness was not a surprise. It was expected, like the turning of the seasons or the wear of a pair of boots. People lived alongside it, tended to it, planned around it. But rarely, if ever, did they defeat it. The idea of curing a disease, banishing it entirely, was not part of the rhythm of daily life. The best most could hope for was comfort, time, and peace. When someone fell ill in a medieval or early modern home, the household shifted. Work paused or reshuffled. The fire was kept burning higher. Water was fetched more frequently. Broths were made, herbs brewed. But beneath all these gestures was a quiet understanding. This might not end in healing. This might only end. Physicians, where they existed, were distant or expensive. Many families turned instead to the local healer, the herbalist, the midwife, the old woman down the road who knew which roots to boil and when to lay a poultice. Some of these remedies helped. They soothed pain, lowered fever, eased restlessness. Others did nothing. A few made things worse. But regardless, they were tried. Because to do nothing felt like surrender. And so caregivers did what they could. Cool cloths for heat. Heated stones for chill. Honey and herbs for sore throats. Chamomile for sleep. Willow bark for pain. Garlic, vinegar, soot, lard. Ingredients combined not with precision, but with hope. Hope and habit and desperation. Yet more often than not, none of it worked. There were no antibiotics, no surgeries, no transfusions. No scans to reveal hidden infections. No names for so many fevers that swept through the village in waves. A cough could mean a cold, or it could mean weeks of decline. A fever might break, or it might not. The body ultimately decided. And so families watched. They watched a child who no longer stirred from sleep. A mother who grew quiet with pain. A brother who, only yesterday, walked to the field, now unable to rise. They watched and they waited. Sometimes for improvement. Often, simply for the end. This experience of helpless, prolonged care was nearly universal. In every village, in every household, someone had sat through long nights, listening for breath. Someone had lit the fire at midnight, not for warmth, but because the room had grown too still. Someone had wiped the brow of a fading loved one, knowing it might be the last gesture they could offer. Death was not always sudden. It came by degrees. It hollowed out the cheeks. It slowed the limbs. It took appetite, speech, then sight. In its final stages, it was often marked by a quiet, less dramatic than we imagine, more like sleep that forgets to end. But even in its quiet, it left marks. Grief, of course, was real, but so too was exhaustion. For those who remained, life resumed with the work still waiting. Fields to plow. Children to feed. Firewood to gather. There was rarely time for mourning in the way we now understand it. Burial followed quickly. The bed was stripped. The herbs swept away. And slowly, the house folded back into its rhythm. And yet, there was tenderness. Though medical knowledge was limited, care was not absent. Love, in its own wordless way, filled the room. The act of tending to the sick was not viewed as a burden, but a duty, often a final gift. Mothers cradled grown sons. Wives sat beside husbands until the end. Neighbors came with food or just silence. Even when there was nothing to be done, something was offered. And that something mattered. In some traditions, a dying person was never left alone. A hand remained in theirs until the last breath. In others, holy words were whispered, or songs sung softly to guide the spirit out. Candles might be lit. Windows cracked open. These rituals gave structure to the incomprehensible. They reminded the living that they had done what they could. It is easy now to forget how many people, throughout history, died in their own homes, surrounded not by machines or clinical light, but by family, firelight, and the scent of herbs hanging from the rafters. And it is easy to forget how many watched them go, powerless but present. Imagine, then, that room again. The fire gives off a low warmth. The shadows move gently. Someone sleeps, fitfully. You sit nearby. You don't speak. There's nothing left to say, but your hand rests on theirs. The cloth is folded neatly. The air is still. And in that moment, without medicine, without cure, you are doing everything that can be done. Facing the constant risk of fire consuming all. Imagine a quiet village at night. Small cottages nestled shoulder to shoulder, each with a single glowing hearth at its center. The walls are timber, the roofs thatched with dry straw, and the wind carries the faint smell of ash and cooking smoke. A baby stirs. A cow shifts in its stall. And somewhere, in the chimney or beneath the cooking pot, a single ember glows a little too bright. And just like that, everything is at risk. In the medieval and early modern world, fire was comfort, but also terror. It warmed the home, baked the bread, boiled the linens, and lit the darkness. But fire never fully belonged to the people who used it. It was borrowed, coaxed, and barely tamed. and it always watched for an opportunity to escape. The materials of daily life were not resistant. Roofs were made of thatch, bundles of straw layered thick and dry, easily kindled by even a drifting spark. Walls were wood, daubed with clay that cracked in the cold. Floors were often packed earth, but strewn with rushes or hay for warmth. Every room held flammable goods, clothing, oil, sacks of grain. Even beds were potential fuel, frames of oak, mattresses stuffed with straw or wool. And at the center of all this was the hearth, a source of life and a constant, quiet threat. To live in such a world was to know, intimately and continually, that everything you owned, everything your family had built over generations, could vanish in a matter of minutes. One overturned lantern, one chimney spark caught by the breeze, one moment of carelessness at the oven door. There were no fire stations, no hydrants, no alarms. If fire came, it was the responsibility of neighbors, of whoever could be roused in time. Bucket chains formed quickly, lines of men, women, and children passing water from the nearest well. But a bucket was small, and a fire moved fast, especially if the wind was in the wrong mood. In dense towns and cities, the danger was greater still. Homes leaned into the streets, roofs touched. Windows faced each other across narrow alleys. A single fire, if not contained immediately, could leap from house to house, climbing walls and igniting roof lines like kindling. Entire districts vanished this way. London, Hamburg, Edinburgh, all saw great fires that reshaped their streets and laws. But you didn't need to live in a city to fear fire. In a countryside cottage, isolated and surrounded by field or forest, the risk was just as constant. Lightning struck barns. Sparks jumped from cooking grates. Lanterns toppled in stables. And in the night, with wind pushing flames along the roofline, there was often nothing to be done but run. There were few insurance schemes. No recovery funds. If your home burned, you rebuilt or you moved on. And yet, people stayed. They built again with the same materials, the same designs. But they did learn. Slowly, through bitter experience and careful tradition, they developed ways to resist fire, not perfectly, but enough to delay its spread. Hearths were raised on stone. Chimneys were lined with tile. Thatch, once allowed to grow wild, was trimmed and packed more tightly. In some towns, people were fined for keeping uncovered fire pits or failing to sweep chimneys. In others, it became law to store water at the ready or to maintain fire hooks on the street for pulling down burning thatch. Fire watches began to emerge, night watchmen tasked with walking the streets, sniffing for smoke, listening for shouts, and scanning for the first flickers on rooftops. In some villages, bells were designated specifically to warn of fire, and children were taught to recognize the rhythm of their toll. Still, there was no way to eliminate the risk. And so fire was not simply feared. It was respected, treated almost as a presence in the home, like an honored guest who must never be left alone. Embers were banked carefully each night. Ashes were spread outside in designated pits. Iron pokers, long and blackened, rested near every hearth, not just for stirring flames but for separating burning logs in a hurry. The rituals of fire control entered language. Children were told never to play with the flame. Women checked the hearth last before leaving the house. Men built barns at a distance to keep stored hay from igniting the home. And in some cultures, a bowl of water was left near the fire overnight, not for use, but as a symbolic gesture of balance. When fire did strike, the loss was total. Records tell of households watching silently as flames consumed walls, furniture, tools, and food stores. Chickens trapped in coops. Oxen driven from stables. Neighbors formed lines and soaked adjacent houses, not to save the one already burning, but to stop the fire from spreading. And afterward, there was the ash, the strange quiet, the blackened beams and twisted iron. Yet the survivors swept and rebuilt. It was not just necessity, it was continuity. A stubborn belief that the fire may return, but so will the family. Even today, in certain old buildings, you can still see traces of this legacy. Fire marks, plaques hung on stone walls to show the building was protected by early fire insurance companies. Firebacks, Cast iron plates placed at the back of fireplaces to reflect heat and protect walls. And in museum hearths, the long tools of vigilance, the poker, the bellows, the hook. Fire never left our lives. It only changed shape. But for much of history, the knowledge was visceral, that warmth and ruin were separated by a few inches of care. That one gust of wind, one careless ember, could undo years of labor. And that every night, as you lay beneath a wooden roof, the fire continued its quiet work, contained, but never tame. So as you drift now into your own night, beneath a roof of safer materials and walls lined with wires and switches, remember those who slept with one ear tuned to the hearth, who stirred the embers and shut the flue, who stepped out in the dark to check the barn, just in case. Because they understood something we've almost forgotten, that fire is never just a tool. It is a presence. And in the quiet corners of the past, it waited, living with vermin that consumed stored grain. Imagine a barn just before dawn. The air inside is cool, still, and carries the dry, papery scent of stored straw. The walls are thick, the floor is swept, and near the back, rows of barrels and sacks lean quietly against one another, carefully arranged, tied, sealed. This is the village's most guarded treasure, the grain stores. And yet, even now, something shifts beneath the surface. A faint scurry, a soft rustle, tiny feet navigating the shadows between sack and beam. The gnawing has already begun. For most of human history, storing food wasn't the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of another quiet battle. Rats, mice, weevils. Insects too small to notice until the damage was already done. Vermin were a constant presence in the rhythm of rural life, especially where grain meant survival. And each morning brought the same anxious task, inspecting what remained. The losses were rarely dramatic. A few kernels here, a hole in the corner of a sack, a bit of frayed cloth, a trail of husks. But behind each small sign was a larger fear. How much more was taken? Grain was more than just food. It was next season's bread, next spring's seed, next winter's security. And the pests that crept into granaries weren't just nuisances, they were quiet thieves of time, labor, and hope. Rats were the worst of them. Larger than mice, clever, agile. They could climb walls, squeeze through small spaces, burrow into earth floors or behind thatch. Their teeth never stopped growing, which meant they never stopped chewing, through rope, through wood, even through stone in time. A sealed barrel wasn't protection. It was simply a puzzle waiting to be solved. And rats weren't solitary. They came in families, in colonies. One or two might be bearable, but one or two always meant more. In the poorest homes, the line between storage and sleeping quarters was thin. Sometimes the grain sack was kept beside the bed, or beneath the table, or hidden under cloth in the corner. There was no separate barn, no granary. Just one room, and a quiet, nightly contest over whose hunger would win. Children learned early to recognize the signs. Tiny droppings like grains of pepper, shredded fabric, the sharp scent of urine in the dark. Sometimes you heard them, scraping, squeaking, scuttling. But more often, the damage spoke louder than the sound. Efforts to stop them varied. Cats, of course, were common, kept not just as pets but as working animals. A good mouser was praised, fed, even mentioned in wills. But cats could only do so much. For every rat they caught, several more slipped by. Traps existed, though rudimentary. Buckets with bait, boxes propped with sticks, snares set near burrow holes. In some areas, people dug shallow moats around storage rooms or raised floors on stilts. But none of it guaranteed safety. In fact, most strategies focused not on prevention, but on endurance. People learned to store grain in smaller portions, so one sack ruined wouldn't mean total loss. They used herbs like mint or lavender, not because they were effective repellents, but because they masked the scent of food. They layered sacks within barrels, hoping the outer one would be sacrificed. Some even whispered protective charms as they sealed their stores, not magical solutions, perhaps, but a way to feel less helpless in the face of daily erosion. Because that's what it was, a slow erosion. Not a single disaster, but an ongoing subtraction. A handful of grain lost here, a corner of seed eaten there. Every bit mattered, and every bite stolen meant a little less security for the family that had worked all season to gather it. And it wasn't just food. Rats carried disease, though this wasn't always fully understood. What was known, however, was that sickness often followed infestation. Fleas. Fever. If a home had too many rats, people got ill. If a granary was overrun, the livestock sometimes refused to eat. The connection between vermin and decay was clear, even if the reasons were not. Still, people carried on. They couldn't stop the gnawing in the walls, but they could adapt to it. And so each morning someone, usually the eldest or the most able, would check the stores, run their hands over the sacks, lift the lids, count, weigh, sniff. The smallest change could signal trouble. Infestation. In some years, the losses were light. A few weeks of vigilance, a few well-fed cats. But in others, especially when the harvest was small or the winter long, the balance tipped. Then came harder choices. Do you eat the grain early, knowing it may be ruined if left? Do you plant it, hoping to salvage a future even as the present suffers? Do you feed the livestock or the children first? There are records of families who survived winter only to find their seed grain destroyed by spring. Of communities who opened their last sack and found nothing but husks and dust. And even then, the complaints were rare. The fear of shame was strong. Admitting your stores were overrun meant admitting weakness. So people simply bore it, repaired the damage, dug new holes, spread more ash, tried again. It's easy now to forget how fragile a full larder once was. How much work went into protecting what had already been harvested. How each kernel was not just food, but a promise. And so the quiet war against vermin never truly ended. It simply became another part of life, another sound in the night, another task in the morning. If you ever visit an old barn and you see a barrel reinforced with wire, or a floor raised above the ground, or a cat curled near the rafters, know that these are not just practical features. They are echoes of fear, traces of a time when survival depended on silence, patience, and the constant hope that what you had gathered would still be there when you needed it most. Bearing the weight of debts that never seemed to shrink, imagine a modest house at the edge of a village, its walls patched with care, its roof of thatch slightly bowed by the years. A man stands in the doorway, staring not out toward the fields, but down at the ground beneath his feet. It's the end of the day. The sun is low. His hands are sore from digging, but his thoughts are not on the soil. They're on the coin he does not have. In the medieval world, borrowing was not rare. It was expected. For peasants, tradespeople, even lesser nobles, debt was a familiar weight. Not scandalous, not criminal, simply necessary. A bad harvest, a broken plow, a roof that sagged too low to ignore. These were not extravagances. They were problems that required coin. And when coin was short, borrowing began. A peasant might borrow to buy seed in early spring. Without it, the fields would remain empty. Or he might borrow a pair of oxen to plow them, strong animals that belonged to a neighbor, a reeve, or a local lord. Others borrowed to repair tools, to replace lost livestock, to pay a tax levied too suddenly. The reasons varied. The process did not. Loans weren't taken from banks, but from people, wealthier farmers, millers, moneylenders, or local officials. Some lent willingly, others with profit in mind. The terms might be simple: a bushel of grain repaid with 2 by harvest. Or more complex: repayment in labor, in goods, in vague promises drawn out across seasons. At first, the debt might seem manageable. A handful of coins, a few sacks of rye. But time had a way of distorting it. A bad harvest meant less to repay. A sick child meant less labor. A new tax meant less coin to spare. And so the debt grew, not in size, but in presence. It lingered. Repayment was rarely a single event. It came in pieces: bundles of thatch offered in lieu of silver, an extra day of labor during shearing season, a portion of wool handed over quietly before winter. These gestures slowed the drain, but rarely stopped it. What began as a temporary solution stretched into a quiet permanence. Some families lived for decades under such arrangements. A son might inherit not just the land, but the debt attached to it. And though it wasn't always written down, often it wasn't written at all, everyone remembered. The lender remembered. The village remembered. And the debtor never forgot. The weight of it was not just financial. It shaped how people lived. A man in debt might be required to work extra days for his lord, outside the agreed labor owed. He might lose first choice at the mill, or be passed over when the common land was divided. His standing among neighbors shifted. Not overtly, not cruelly, but perceptibly. Even church tithes became part of the equation. A tenth of everything owed to God, even when there was barely enough to survive. Some churches forgave small debts. Others did not. And if death came before repayment, it was believed the soul might linger, unsettled. Debts weighed not just on the body, but on the spirit. Some lenders were fair, generous even. They extended terms, forgave small sums, accepted goods in kind. Others were less forgiving. Some took land in repayment, or children as apprentices, or livestock at undervalued rates. A man might find his household slowly chipped away. First the goat, then the tools, then the right to graze on shared pasture. And always the ledger remained unwritten. But it lived, in memory, in whispered calculations, in the way a neighbor's glance lingered too long when the rent came due. Among the elite, debt had a different flavor. Nobles borrowed to fund campaigns, to outfit retinues, to pay ransoms or dowries. Their loans were larger, but more formal, sealed with wax, witnessed by scribes. Yet even they felt the grip. Castles were mortgaged. Titles were traded for coin. Influence flowed toward those who could lend without blinking. But for the common person, debt was not strategy. It was endurance, a slow siphon of effort. You worked harder, not to get ahead, but to keep from falling further behind. The extra hours, the extra yield, the extra kindness, none of it was truly yours. It went first to the lender, then to the family. Still, life went on. The rhythm endured. Planting, harvesting, repairing, repaying. Children were born. Elders passed. The cycle turned. And with each passing year, the debt was not always paid, but it was managed. Folded into routine. Born like a familiar ache. Occasionally, fortune shifted. A particularly good harvest. A bit of inherited land. A marriage that brought in new coin. In such cases, the debt might be cleared, quietly, even humbly. And when that happened, the household breathed differently. Not freer, perhaps, but lighter. More often, though, the weight remained. So, imagine again the man at his door. He's not defeated. He will rise tomorrow. He'll walk to the field. He'll count the rows, watch the sky, tend what must be tended. But beneath it all, he knows, some part of what he earns is already spoken for, already gone. And yet he works, because there is no other way. Submitting to authority that could not be questioned. Imagine standing in a village square, early morning mist curling around your ankles. The sun is barely up. A few chickens scratch along the edges of the path. Across the way, a figure approaches, mounted, cloaked, accompanied by two quiet men on foot. The villagers do not speak. They bow their heads. They step aside. No one asks what business brings the magistrate. No one dares. In the world of the past, power was not always loud, but it was always present. Lords, stewards, magistrates, and bailiffs governed more than just laws. They governed air. Conversation shifted when they approached. Eyes lowered. Bodies moved without question. Because to question, to even appear unsure, was to risk more than embarrassment. It was to risk everything. Authority in most medieval and early modern communities was personal and local. A lord might live only miles away, but his reach extended into every corner of village life. Land, labor, marriage, trade, all passed through his hands, either directly or through appointed agents. A magistrate held sway not just over legal matters, but over mood, tone, and fear. The rules might be written in parchment, but the consequences were delivered in looks, in silences, and in doors that would no longer open for you. For the average villager, grievances, when they arose, were often swallowed. A stolen hen, a false weight at market, a tax unfairly levied. The cause might be small, the resentment real, but the outlet uncertain. Where would you bring your complaint? Against whom? And at what cost? Formal petitions required resources, time, literacy, connections. More importantly, they required confidence, something few dared summon. A man who complained too often might be labeled difficult. A woman who challenged a steward's ruling might find her family's grazing rights quietly reduced. The punishment was not always visible. It might come as a delay, a denial, or a missing favor when most needed. And so, many chose silence. Not because they lacked awareness, but because they understood the nature of survival. Submission in this world was not always weakness. It was strategy. To bow one's head, to step aside, to say nothing, that was how one endured. This silence was not total. In some cases, villages came together in subtle acts of resistance. A path blocked by brush. A gate left open for animals to wander. Rumors whispered just loud enough to cause discomfort. But these were quiet acts. They gave voice to frustration without offering a target. Rarely were they traced. Rarer still were they punished directly. Among tenants, the Lord was not merely a landholder. He was, in many cases, a symbol of divine order. The great chain of being placed him above them by design, by birth, by grace, by fate. To question him was not only rebellious, it was unnatural. Church sermons echoed the message: honor the king, fear the magistrate, obey your betters. These were not suggestions. They were survival skills, carved deep into habit. In courts, the imbalance was stark. A villager might stand before a man who wore a robe, carried a seal, and was addressed as your worship. The villager had only his word, and even that might falter under pressure. Truth was not always protection. Justice, in theory, was blind. In practice, it saw rank very clearly. Sometimes, even gestures of loyalty were required. A forced oath. A fine paid not for guilt, but for demonstration. A neighbor punished not because he erred, but because someone had to be seen punished. These events left marks. Not scars of the body, but of the spirit. A sense that fairness was not promised. That outcomes did not depend on right or wrong, but on whim. And yet, through it all, people lived. They adjusted. They read the moods of their masters like weather. They taught their children when to speak and when to stay silent. And they created lives full of meaning, laughter, and ritual around the edges of authority, beneath its shadow. A wedding might still bring joy. A harvest, however taxed, still fed the table. Feasts were shared, songs sung, children born and blessed. But the presence of power lingered. Even in celebration, one eye watched the road, just in case the steward passed by. Occasionally, someone would speak. A tenant who had had enough. A widow who refused an unfair levy. A craftsman who caught a magistrate in hypocrisy. Sometimes these acts were quietly admired. Sometimes they were quietly punished. And life went on. We often imagine the past as a place of open defiance. Pitchforks, torches, rebellion. And yes, those moments existed. But far more often, authority was met with endurance. With the kind of submission that doesn't come from belief, but from calculation. With quiet days marked by quiet choices. When to nod, when to pause, when to look away. And over time, that submission left its mark. Not just on individuals, but on communities. On stories that were not told. On grievances that never left the hearth. On generations who learned to live within boundaries drawn long before they were born. So when you picture a village green or a manor house overlooking tilled fields, imagine too the invisible weight pressing down. Not a boot, not a shout, just a silence. The pause. A habit of obedience that needed no reminder. In the rhythm of their lives, submission was not surrender. It was how one moved forward without stumbling. How one breathed within the rules. It was not praise. It was practice. And sometimes, in the quiet corners, it was the beginning of something waiting. Waiting not for justice, but for the chance, one day, to speak. Carrying the shame of a family disgrace that never died, there is a house on the edge of the village. Old stone, a leaning fence, and windows that catch the light just a little differently than the others. You might pass it and notice nothing. Or perhaps, if you ask the right person in the right tone, you'll hear a name spoken in a lower voice. Not with anger, not with sympathy, but with that particular hush reserved for things half-remembered and never fully forgiven. Every community has its silences, and in many households, especially in the tightly bound world of centuries past, there was one silence that echoed more than the rest, the unspoken weight of disgrace. In a time before anonymity, before the mobility of modern life, a person was known by name, by family, by place. To belong was everything, but to belong while bearing the shadow of a family scandal, that was a quiet, lifelong burden. One that shaped lives in ways both subtle and inescapable. Perhaps a grandfather had betrayed a neighbor in time of famine, or an aunt had married against custom. Perhaps someone was hanged or publicly shamed, or fled in the night and was never seen again. The specifics, in time, often blurred, but the memory remained. Not as a story told, but as a story not told. A wound held just below the surface. You might imagine a child growing up under that shadow. They were not punished, not blamed directly. But doors opened more slowly for them. Apprenticeships vanished without reason. Suitors hesitated. Teachers watched a little more closely. And in the home, when the past surfaced, as it always did, it came in fragments. A sudden silence. A change of subject. A look exchanged between elders. In some communities, this was called a stain. In others, a curse. But the effect was the same. A single event, often years or decades past, became part of the family fabric. Woven into their name, their status, their future. And no matter how honest, hardworking, or generous the new generation might be, they carried it all the same. The burden was not always open hostility. More often, it was isolation. Invitations not extended. Opportunities quietly withheld. A child might not know why others kept their distance, only that they did. And by the time they understood, the story was half lost, too distant to defend against, too close to ignore. Attempts to erase the shame rarely succeeded. Some families tried to change their name. Others moved if they could. But even then, the past had a way of following. Through rumor, through record, through the invisible paths gossip traveled between markets, churches, and crossroads. And sometimes, the shame came not from something done, but something believed. Whispers of sorcery. A parent who took their own life. A brother who vanished into criminal company. None of it confirmed. All of it remembered. These were not just stories, they were shaping forces. They defined who could marry whom, who could inherit land, who could join the guild, or serve in the church. Reputation was currency. And once marked, a family often found their balance forever changed. But still, life went on. People adapted. They learned what could be spoken and what could not. They softened the details, reworded the tale, or, in many cases, simply stopped asking. And with that silence came a kind of survival. A person could live a long, quiet life under the shadow of a scandal they never caused. Some even carried it with pride, eventually. A private defiance. They worked harder, gave more, refused to be known only by the mistake of a man buried 2 generations ago. And in rare moments, a community softened. A long life lived well could blunt old edges. The memory dimmed. The whispers lost volume. But even then, the wound never quite closed. The disgrace lived on in small ways. A pause when the surname was spoken. A folded letter. An empty seat at a wedding feast. There was no legal sentence, no scar on the skin. Only memory. And memory, in small places, was the most enduring of all punishments. Still, within families marked this way, there was tenderness. Quiet loyalty. Those who bore the shame together often grew close. Bonds formed in silence, in shared glances, in the gentle ways people tried to protect each other from a past they never chose. You might picture an elder warning a grandchild not to ask questions in public, not to press for details, not to bring it up again at market, not because they were angry, but because they remembered what it cost. Or a young woman lighting a candle for someone whose name was never spoken aloud in the household, an ancestor erased from the family Bible but not from the bloodline. Her act was not of rebellion, but remembrance. A kind of healing. Quiet, patient, slow. So many families carried such stories. Few spoke them. Fewer still wrote them down. But behind many doors, some of which still stand, with lintels worn smooth and beams that creak at night, there are memories shaped not by what was done, but by what could never be undone. And that is the heart of it. In a world where honor was measured in land, in lineage, in standing, to be marked by disgrace was to carry a burden without weight, without sound, without end. A burden passed hand to hand like an heirloom, except no one ever wished to receive it. And yet, life continued. Meals were cooked, babies born, crops planted, candles lit at night. Not in shame, but in endurance. So imagine once more that quiet house near the edge of the village. The fence leans. The light flickers behind the curtain. Inside, someone sits by the fire, holding a name they didn't choose, carrying a silence inherited long before they were born. Not bitter, not broken, just still, steady, waiting for time to pass and for the story to lose its hold. As all stories do, eventually. Worrying about bandits on roads that never felt safe, the road stretches out before you, uneven, muddy, flanked by scrub and hedgerow. It dips into shadow where the trees grow close, then rises again into open heath. A cart has passed this way recently. The ruts are still wet. But there are no sounds now. Just wind. Just the creak of your own pack strap and the quiet rhythm of your feet. Always, the occasional glance over the shoulder. In the medieval and early modern world, travel was never entirely a private act. To step onto the road was to enter shared space, not with crowds, not with traffic, but with possibility. And not all of it good. Bandits, highwaymen, cut purses, and opportunists haunted the spaces between settlements. Not always in the open, not always with blades drawn. But their presence was assumed, not constant, but constant enough that no journey could be made without thought of them. Even well-traveled routes, merchant roads, pilgrimage trails, the lanes between one village and the next, carried stories. The spot by the old oak, where a man disappeared. The turn near the stream, where a merchant's cart was found overturned. The bend before the hill, where travelers said you shouldn't stop, not even to rest your feet. Sometimes these stories were vague. But often, they were true enough. Because while most people journeyed with purpose, carrying grain to market, bringing cloth from town, or simply walking to visit kin, a few traveled for different reasons. Desperation, survival, and the road gave them cover. There was no consistent policing of the countryside. A sheriff might patrol a region, and certain towns kept a watch on nearby paths, but in the long miles between villages, you were largely on your own. Or, if fortunate, in the company of others. Travelers learned to walk in groups when they could. Pilgrims banded together not only for prayer, but for protection. Traders formed small caravans. Even local farmers timed their market days to leave and return together. There was safety in numbers, and silence in fear. Banditry took many forms. It might be a quick ambush, 2 or 3 men in cloaks, stepping from behind a hedgerow with sticks and threats. Or it might be subtler, someone walking just behind you for too long, or a rider who watches from a distance before vanishing into the trees. Wealth was not always the target. Food, boots, warm cloaks, these were often more valuable. A stolen loaf might mean survival for one family and hunger for another. Horses, if taken, disappeared quickly into other villages, resold before the loss could be reported. In rougher regions, mountain passes, marshlands, or crumbling Roman roads still in use, bandits sometimes made camp semi-permanently. They learned the rhythms of the road. They knew who came through and when. And while they rarely attacked large groups or armed convoys, lone travelers made easy marks. Women, especially, traveled with particular caution. Even short distances were fraught. Some carried knives. Others disguised themselves in men's clothing. Many avoided travel entirely unless escorted by a household member or neighbor. But even men, even soldiers, were not immune. A returning soldier might carry his pay in a pouch at his waist. A woodsman might have tools worth taking. And a young boy sent to market might not return, not because he wandered, but because someone else watched the road more closely. Some travelers carried charms, iron nails, herbs, crosses carved into walking sticks. A few whispered protective prayers before setting out. Others chose their roads based on daylight, preferring the longer path if it meant fewer trees. The idea was not to prevent attack entirely, but to pass unnoticed. Banditry was not new. In Roman times, patrol roads were built to guard trade routes. In the Middle Ages, watchtowers were sometimes erected at dangerous bends. Monasteries placed outposts near known trouble spots to care for injured travelers. But the fear remained. Even when roads were clear, the worry lingered. A path too quiet could be unnerving. A figure in the distance might be a shepherd or something else. A pause to drink from the stream might feel indulgent, exposed. The sense of being watched was not always irrational. And even when it was, it shaped the journey. Stories helped keep the danger alive. In every region, tales were told of the traveler who didn't return. Sometimes they were cautionary fictions. Other times they had names, dates, places where someone's boot was found or where a cartwheel turned up in the brush. And yet, people still walked. Merchants still carried wares to town. Children still ran messages between households. Priests still made their rounds. Because life required movement, and risk was not new. It was only another part of the landscape. To manage it, travelers developed rituals. Some knocked on wood before setting out. Others walked in silence for the first mile. A few muttered small greetings to invisible guardians of the road, spirits, saints, or simply the land itself. And when someone returned safely, whether from a neighboring village or a week's journey away, the relief was quiet, but felt. Boots were dusted, bread was offered, and the story of the journey, where they walked, what they saw, whether the road felt heavy, was told over meals and remembered. Today, the road seems different. Paved, patrolled, lined with signs. But the caution lingers in language. We still speak of looking over one's shoulder, of a dark turn in the road, of being waylaid. These phrases come from lives once lived where the road was both a path forward and a question mark. So as you imagine that old path, winding through trees and shadow, with the rustle of dry leaves and the creak of leather straps, know that you would not have walked it without thought. You would have listened. You would have watched. And you would have hoped, with every step, that your name would not be added to the stories told in hushed tones. That this journey, like so many before it, would end not in silence, but in return. Watching children grow sick without explanation, imagine a cottage set just beyond the edge of a village, where the thatch dips low over the windows and the earth outside is worn from many small footsteps. In the yard, toys lie still, a carved hoop, a wooden figure, a doll with its cloth body faded by the sun. The house is quiet now. Too quiet. Inside, the hearth still burns low, though no one is cooking. The bedding has been stirred and straightened again and again. A child's cough echoes faintly from the far corner. And there, beside the bed, a mother sits, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of a breath that has grown thinner, fainter, less certain with every passing hour. For most of history, this scene was not rare. In every village, every hamlet, every household, there came a season, sometimes many, when children fell ill. Without clear cause. Without clear cure. Sometimes it began with a fever. Sometimes a cough. Sometimes a restlessness that no one could name. One day, a child was laughing in the field. The next, they could not rise from bed. And no one knew why. There were names, of course, the flux, the ague, fever of the blood. But names were often just comfort, a way to speak around the fear. Because the truth was simpler and harder, they did not understand. Not fully. Not the cause. Not the cure. Not why one child recovered and another did not. Sometimes it happened in winter, when the air was close and the fire burned day and night. When the same smoke that warmed also thickened the lungs. Sometimes it came with spring, when the earth thawed and water pooled near doorsteps, carrying sickness where there had only been snow. And sometimes it arrived in summer, sudden and sharp, A fever that rose like fire and left as silence. Children grew sick quickly. That was the part most feared. One day of sniffles might be nothing. 2 days of coughing may be rest. But by the third, they could be still. Too still. Doctors, when they came, offered mixtures of herbs, or oils to rub into the skin, or leeches to balance what they called the humors. Midwives and mothers had their own remedies. Onions cut and placed near the bed, broth stirred with prayers, cool cloths soaked in vinegar. But everyone knew that more often than not, the illness would run its course regardless. You could only watch. You could only wait. In many homes, the watching became its own kind of ritual. The folding of cloth, the smoothing of hair, the counting of breaths in the night, the whispered prayers, sometimes repeated dozens of times, not because they were believed to be magical, but because there was nothing else to do. Some children would rise again, slowly, pale and thin, but smiling once more. Others would not. And in that difference lay a sorrow deeper than words. Small graves dotted the edges of villages, not in the grand cemeteries, but often in quiet corners of the churchyard, or in little mounds near the home. They were tended gently. A handful of flowers. A smoothed stone. A cross carved not by a mason, but by a father's hand. Rarely were these deaths spoken of directly. Grief was not absent, but it was private, quiet, folded into the rhythms of daily life. The cradle was put away. The shoes left by the hearth remained where they were. Meals were cooked. Bread was baked. But something had gone missing, and everyone knew. Some families lost one child. Some lost several. The numbers were never even. Disease made no promises. It took where it chose. Even in noble households, illness was no respecter of wealth or lineage. Princes and peasants alike watched their children fall to ailments no physician could name. And through it all, people sought meaning. Some blamed the weather or the stars. Some believed it was punishment for sin. Others whispered of curses, or ill-wishing neighbors, or spirits drawn to the warmth of young life. In times of desperation, charms were sewn into children's clothing. Amulets were hung above the cradle. But even these protections wore thin in the face of breathless nights. There were customs meant to guard against death's return. A child's name might be changed during illness, in hopes of confusing the spirit of sickness. If a family had lost multiple children, a newborn might be baptized with a name from the past, an effort to bind them to the living, or to trick fate into forgetting. Some buried their children with locks of hair, with toys, or with folded notes no one else would ever read. And always, life went on. Grain still needed grinding. Wood still needed chopping. Lambs were born, roofs leaked, roads turned to mud. The grief settled into the quiet spaces between tasks. A mother might pause at the sound of a cough not heard in months. A father might mend a garment grown too small for anyone now living. These moments were rarely spoken aloud, but they filled the days. Over time, a kind of resilience formed, not because the pain was less, but because it had to be borne. There were other mouths to feed, other hands to hold, and the memory of the lost child remained, not as a wound that bled, but as an absence that never entirely faded. If you visit an old village now and you see the low stones in a churchyard, some with no names, just dates, you are seeing that history. Not of plague or war or disaster, but of everyday loss. The slow attrition of life in a world without explanation, where medicine was scarce and hope was cautious. And yet, even in this, there was love. The care taken with the sickbed, the gentle rocking of a child who could not sleep, the stories whispered, even when the child no longer stirred, the grave tended, season after season, not with spectacle, but with simple, unshakable remembrance. Because in a time when understanding was scarce, the only certainty was presence. To be there, to witness, to remember, quietly. Boys. Watching children grow sick without explanation, imagine a cottage set just beyond the edge of a village, where the thatch dips low over the windows and the earth outside is worn from many small footsteps. In the yard, toys lie still, a carved hoop, a wooden figure, a doll with its cloth body faded by the sun. The house is quiet now. Too quiet. Inside, the hearth still burns low, though no one is cooking. The bedding has been stirred and straightened again and again. A child's cough echoes faintly from the far corner. And there, beside the bed, a mother sits, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of a breath that has grown thinner, fainter, less certain with every passing hour. For most of history, this scene was not rare. In every village, every hamlet, every household, there came a season, sometimes many, when children fell ill. Without clear cause. Without clear cure. Sometimes it began with a fever. Sometimes a cough. Sometimes a restlessness that no one could name. One day, a child was laughing in the field. The next, they could not rise from bed. And no one knew why. There were names, of course, the flux, the ague, fever of the blood. But names were often just comfort, a way to speak around the fear. Because the truth was simpler and harder, they did not understand. Not fully. Not the cause. Not the cure. Not why one child recovered and another did not. Sometimes it happened in winter, when the air was close and the fire burned day and night. When the same smoke that warmed also thickened the lungs. Sometimes it came with spring, when the earth thawed and water pooled near doorsteps, carrying sickness where there had only been snow. And sometimes it arrived in summer, sudden and sharp, a fever that rose like fire and left as silence. Children grew sick quickly. That was the part most feared. One day of sniffles might be nothing. 2 days of coughing may be rest. But by the third they could be still. Too still. Doctors, when they came, offered mixtures of herbs, or oils to rub into the skin, or leeches to balance what they called the humors. Midwives and mothers had their own remedies, onions cut and placed near the bed, broth stirred with prayers, cool cloths soaked in vinegar. But everyone knew that more often than not, the illness would run its course regardless. You could only watch. You could only wait. In many homes, the watching became its own kind of ritual. The folding of cloth, the smoothing of hair, the counting of breaths in the night, the whispered prayers, sometimes repeated dozens of times, not because they were believed to be magical, but because there was nothing else to do. Some children would rise again, slowly, pale and thin, but smiling once more. Others would not. And in that difference lay a sorrow deeper than words. Small graves dotted the edges of villages, not in the grand cemeteries, but often in quiet corners of the churchyard, or in little mounds near the home. They were tended gently. A handful of flowers. A smooth stone. A cross carved not by a mason, but by a father's hand. Rarely were these deaths spoken of directly. Grief was not absent, but it was private, quiet, folded into the rhythms of daily life. The cradle was put away. The shoes left by the hearth remained where they were. Meals were cooked. Bread was baked. But something had gone missing, and everyone knew. Some families lost one child. Some lost several. The numbers were never even. Disease made no promises. It took where it chose. Even in noble households, illness was no respecter of wealth or lineage. Princes and peasants alike watched their children fall to ailments no physician could name. And through it all, people sought meaning. Some blamed the weather or the stars. Some believed it was punishment for sin. Others whispered of curses, or ill-wishing neighbors, or spirits drawn to the warmth of young life. In times of desperation, charms were sewn into children's clothing. Amulets were hung above the cradle. But even these protections wore thin in the face of breathless nights. There were customs meant to guard against death's return. A child's name might be changed during illness, in hopes of confusing the spirit of sickness. If a family had lost multiple children, a newborn might be baptized with a name from the past, an effort to bind them to the living, or to trick fate into forgetting. Some buried their children with locks of hair, with toys, or with folded notes no one else would ever read. And always, life went on. Grain still needed grinding. Wood still needed chopping. Lambs were born, roofs leaked, roads turned to mud. The grief settled into the quiet spaces between tasks. A mother might pause at the sound of a cough not heard in months. A father might mend a garment grown too small for anyone now living. These moments were rarely spoken aloud, but they filled the days. Over time, a kind of resilience formed, Not because the pain was less, but because it had to be borne. There were other mouths to feed, other hands to hold, and the memory of the lost child remained, not as a wound that bled, but as an absence that never entirely faded. If you visit an old village now and you see the low stones in a churchyard, some with no names, just dates, you are seeing that history. Not of plague, or war, or disaster, but of everyday loss. The slow attrition of life in a world without explanation, where medicine was scarce and hope was cautious. And yet, even in this, there was love. The care taken with the sickbed, the gentle rocking of a child who could not sleep, the stories whispered, even when the child no longer stirred, the grave tended, season after season, not with spectacle, but with simple, unshakable remembrance. Because in a time when understanding was scarce, the only certainty was presence. To be there, to witness, to remember, quietly. Boys.